Fab. Okay, well, as I say, thank you all very much, and thank you, Peter, for the opportunity to come and you know, to talk to you guys this evening. I say it would have been originally, it was supposed to be with you guys in person back in March, and then obviously all the restrictions have happened, and so as I say, it's been great to be able to reschedule it and be able to talk to you guys now. And I think hopefully you know, during the period where we've all not been able to travel around so much, you should have had a few slides that I think Peter would have forwarded to you for any of you who were interested. It'd be really good to run the session quite informally this evening. So I have got some slides which I'll talk through. Hopefully it will give you just a bit of an overview. I'm going to have a quick look at carbon footprinting and how that process all works, what the opportunities are for farmers in terms of mitigation. So what can we do to reduce the amount of emissions that we're producing on farm? How does sequestration fit in? You know, where does that leave us? And what are the opportunities to improve sequestration? You know, where does soil carbon fit? And what are the options in the future in terms of how we might pay farmers to be able to protect and enhance the carbon storage of what's going on in their ground. But as I say, if you've got any questions, if you've got any comments as we go through, please shout, but also at the end, hopefully there'll be some time for discussions as well. And we'll try and, as I say, we'll try and keep everybody awake. I say it's really good that you're giving up your time on a Tuesday evening to talk about this subject, which I'm very sad and get very overexcited about, but I can understand that for a lot of people, you know, this is a big, scary subject that potentially, you know, can have a lot of impacts in terms of what happens next. So the real aim this evening is to try and, you know, debunk any myths that any of you guys might have heard or any of those sort of things. You know, it's all based on science, but very much in a practical way so that you can hopefully take some things away which allow you to understand this in a bit more detail. So I suppose just to start off with, who am I? Why am I waffling at you this evening? So yeah, my name's Becky and I am project manager at Farm Carbon Toolkit. Farm Carbon Toolkit has been around since 2009. Now back in 2009, that was the last time that carbon and climate change and agriculture's impact on climate change was in the focus. And so the organisation was set up then because it was felt there was no real farmer-led organisation who was saying, well, what can we do differently on the farm and what are the things that actually make the most difference? So that's why the organisation was set up, and the real aim of it is to really try and encourage and support any farmers or growers to help understand the potential impact of you know, of climate change and all those sort of things on their farm, and then also more importantly, well, what can I do about it? So it provides those tools and resources to allow farmers to understand how to practically reduce their emissions, improve sequestration, and the opportunities that that provides, not just in terms of carbon reduction, but also for business profitability, for resilience, and all the other things as we'll see as we go through this evening. I've been with the organisation since 2013. I've been involved in sort of carbon and greenhouse gases and resource use efficiency for the last 15 years. Back in 2016, I spent 2 years flying around the world, substantially increasing my own carbon footprint, doing a Nuffield scholarship, looking at this subject in terms of how do we move this thing forward. So I've been working in this area for quite a while. What have we got? And I suppose what has the organisation got? Well, the two main pillars of the organisation are the carbon calculator, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about as we go through, which allows you to calculate the carbon footprint or the carbon balance on your farm. So what are the sources of emissions? How much emissions are you producing? Where are you sequestering carbon? So whether that's in any forestry or any hedgerows or stewardship areas or soil. And then it's just basically emissions minus sequestration, which gives you your carbon balance. And then we also have the toolkit. So you can go through that process of doing your carbon footprint. And then instead of just saying, well, what does this number mean? Is it good? Is it bad? What can I do about it? The toolkit is really full of practical tips and ideas to help you sort of say, well, here's the headline number, but actually what can I do differently? We have a range of special projects, the Soil Carbon Project, which I'll talk to you in a little bit more detail about. We also run the Soil Farmer of the Year competition, which aims to really champion and promote those farmers who are putting sustainable soils management at the sort of centre of their business. And we are about to start another couple of projects around a demonstration farm project, looking at how we can practically reduce emissions and other bits and pieces as well. So that's a sort of introduction on Farm Carbon Toolkit and me. Sort of moving on to what we're talking about today. Well, we're going to be talking about greenhouse gas emissions. And this is where we sort of get one of the first one of the first complexities when we start talking about this, because all of the language around this topic is talking about carbon. It's carbon footprinting, it's low carbon farming, it's all these, you know, net zero carbon. But actually, when we're talking about agriculture, carbon is only a very small amount of the issue. We actually have 3 gases that we're dealing with. The, as I say, nitrous oxide, methane and carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is the one that everyone's fairly familiar with. The burning of fossil fuels, which obviously goes into our electricity usage, our diesel usage, machinery, cultivation, is all producing carbon dioxide that's disappearing out of the system. But then if we look at the other 2 gases, we've got methane, and obviously there's been a lot of attention on methane, our poor maligned ruminants. You know, we look at some of the headlines that we've had around, you know, farting cows are causing all the issues. You know, dinner party fact number 1 for you this evening: 98% of the methane comes out of the front end, not the back end, as some of the reports would lead you to believe. But again, there's lots of you know, emissions associated, methane emissions associated with our ruminant animals and also with our manures and slurries. And then nitrous oxide, which comes from soils, and fertilizers, manures are the main sources of nitrous oxide. And that's so for agriculture, we've got this issue where we have to combine, look at what we can do with 3 gases rather than 1 gas, and we have to combine all those emissions of all those gases together in order to create our carbon footprint. But although there's lots of complexity, we are going to be undaunted by that, and it's going to, you know, mean that we've got lots of opportunities. So why manage carbon on the farm? Well, there's lots of policy reasons. You know, as I say, then we have the new net zero legislation. Before that, we had the Climate Change Act, which said we were going to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050. Back in June last year, that was changed. So actually, we're going to be at net zero by 2050 as a country. And then the NFU have come out and said, well, we're going to be at net zero by 2040. And then there's certain county councils that are saying, well, actually, we need to do that sooner. So we need to be at net zero by 2030. So there's all this focus in terms of policy around setting these targets that mean that we can limit global temperature rise, and we can sort of limit our impact in terms of what we are putting, the greenhouse gases that we're putting up into the atmosphere, which are causing changes in the climate. But I'm not going to talk too much about policy. I'm really going to focus this down on why should we manage carbon at the farm level. And the first one is a really important one. It's because it makes business sense. If you were to draw a graph and you were to have emissions on one and cost on the other, you would find that there's a really, really good relationship between reducing emissions, managing your resources more effectively, and saving cost. So there's really good opportunities to sort of make your farm more resilient, to save money, and to be able to sort of, you know, move everything in the right direction by looking at carbon. It's just another lens to look at your business through. So by doing a carbon footprint, it's just another way of looking at how efficient things are. It allows us to be more informed and make decisions. So if you talk about what I was just saying about, you know, the net zero legislation, if we do a carbon footprint and we understand where our baseline is, we can sort of appreciate the size of our individual challenge as our farm. You know, where am I? Am I near net zero? Am I, you know, producing lots of emissions? But unless you actually start to sort of take account of that through doing a carbon footprint, you can't understand what, you know, where you are now, and that's your sort of baseline, which you can then start to improve and move forward from and make decisions. So once you've got that opportunity and once you've got that initial carbon footprint, you can then say, well, what am I trying to do with my business over the next, you know, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? What do I want to do? And actually, what will the impact of those decisions be on my greenhouse gas emissions? So it's another way of looking at those sort of things. It enables a positive narrative, and I think we really need a positive narrative for our industry at the moment, especially when we're talking about this topic. Okay, so there's a really good opportunity. A lot of at the moment, you know, a lot of the narrative around agriculture's environmental impact, especially when we're talking about carbon, is told for us by people that have an alternative agenda. So it gives us a really good opportunity to say, well, actually, you know, livestock aren't as bad as you think they are. Well, actually, I'm doing these really exciting things, which means that I'm, you know, starting to reduce my emissions and improve my sequestration, all those other sort of things. It gives us that data and that knowledge to be able to equip us to change the narrative around our industry, which is really important. It creates more resilient businesses, both in terms of the fact that you can have another way of looking at where your costs are being spent and where your resources are being used, but also, you know, in terms of what's coming in the future, you can just start to get your head around this a little bit now. And as I say, that leads on to that last point around it future-proofs it. And all of that process starts in terms of how we manage carbon on farm. That all starts by doing a carbon footprint, because it's really true, that old adage of, you know, you can't manage what you don't measure. And that measuring is a really, really important first step. It's that first step to be able to quantify the contribution of your farm, which is making to climate change. So again, when we start thinking about that net zero, what's the size of my individual challenge to start to reduce my emissions and improve my sequestration? And put very, very simply, all a carbon footprint does is it identifies the amount and the source of those three different gases, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane, that are emitted from the farm, and highlights areas where you might be able to slightly change things or make improvements to reduce emissions. As I said earlier, it allows you to be more aware, but those metrics that you use, so that carbon footprint that you do, needs to be relevant, so it needs to make sense to your business. It needs to be practical, so it needs to be allowing you to put in information which means that you can then look at the impact of management. It needs to be consistent, and consistency is really, really important. And it needs to be that first step in terms of informing what happens next. So it shouldn't be a case that actually, you know, you do your carbon footprint and it's such a hideous process that you have to go and lie down in a darkened room for 3 weeks to get over it, and actually then you put it on the shelf. The idea is that that carbon footprint is the sort of first step and you along the sort of journey to say, well, you know, this is my baseline, but actually what does it mean, and what can I see from what I've done in this one, and how can I then start to improve it in the future? Now, there's loads of different tools available in terms of being able to calculate your carbon footprint. Obviously, I'm going to talk to you today about Farm Carbon Calculator, but there are lots out there, and there are some that are, are for specific supply chains. So, Alltech ECO2, for example, is used a lot in beef supply chains. It's used a lot in dairy supply chains. And then you have Farm Carbon Calculator, the Cool Farm Tool, and AgriCalc, which are the three which sort of sit across all different farm business types and enterprises. And then SolidGrow is one which was developed in France and is an Excel-based sheet. But there's lots of different options out there. And each of them have their benefits and have their drawbacks. None of the carbon calculators that are out there are perfect. This whole area of carbon footprinting is an evolving science. However, just because none of them are perfect, it doesn't mean that we have, that we have to say, well, actually, we're not going to bother with this for the next 10 years while you guys sort it out. We've got to start somewhere, because, as I say, there's there's sort of targets and everything being put on it. It's actually a really good opportunity. And the really important thing is to just understand what that calculator includes and what it doesn't, and just become a bit more aware of how the calculations work. And why do they differ? Well, they can differ for all sorts of reasons. They differ because they might include or leave out different things. So some of them might be looking at everything that happens within the farm. Some of them might be looking at a supply chain. The level of detail. So some of them might be looking very much at the sort of broad brush. So you're just going to sort of get a figure per kilo of beef or per litre of milk or per kilo of lamb. And some are very much looking at, I'm going to make you put everything in so that we can look at what the management opportunities are. Do they include carbon sequestration? It's a key question, and one that's really important to understand before you start this. Is carbon sequestration, the good stuff, included in my footprinting calculation? And when you choose one, a key question really to start thinking about is, well, what do you want to know? Are you looking for reporting your carbon footprint in a way that's going to help your marketing? In which case you want to find something that is very transparent and reliable, so that you can if you want to create a marketing campaign, for example, I'm producing carbon neutral beef, I'm producing carbon neutral lamb, I've managed to cut my carbon footprint by X percentage, and this is what I can put on my bottle of milk or whatever, then you want something that's got the stamp of approval and all those sort of things. If you're wanting to actually understand, well, where within my farm am I producing the most emissions, and what are those management things that I'm doing that are something that I might need to look at, then you need to have one that you need to put that level of detail in the start. And again, there's lots of different ways that do it in terms of the sort of complexity of them, how much time you've got. But I'm going to talk to you today about our carbon calculator. It follows the USP of the organisation. It was developed by farmers for farmers. It's completely free to use. You can create as many accounts as you like. You can create as many different scenarios as you like. It accounts for soil carbon sequestration, really, really important. A lot of the early carbon calculators didn't have soil carbon in them at all. It's still an evolving process with a lot of them. Some of them still don't include it. And the way it works currently on the calculator is you have to have 2 years worth of soil data to populate it. But what we're doing is we're linking into a big soil carbon project that we're running at the moment that I'll talk to you a bit more as we go through, to populate a model so that if you don't have those 2 years worth of soil organic matter data, then you can use the sort of proxy measures to include those. It allows you to monitor your footprint annually, and it provides your footprint as a carbon dioxide equivalent. So as I said at the beginning, we're talking with 3 gases, and what it does is it converts the nitrous oxide and the methane into a carbon dioxide equivalent when it's reported. But you can see within the calculation where those emissions are coming from. So although it might say, you know, your carbon footprint is 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, you can then see how much of that is nitrous oxide and how much of it is methane, so you can start to understand the balance. It includes the new methane methodology. So I don't know how many of you guys have heard, but there's been some new work that's been done at Oxford University, which says that methane doesn't actually, has been overestimated because it doesn't behave like the other greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide, when it comes out the back of an exhaust pipe or wherever it comes from, basically goes up into the atmosphere and then stays at that level for thousands and thousands of years. And unless it's pulled out of the atmosphere, mechanically, it's there. Nitrous oxide is the same. So nitrous oxide is actually more potent in terms of its ability to thicken the blanket around the earth. So it's 298 times more potent. So that gets released and then it's there, you know, it's there in the atmosphere, as I say, indefinitely. Methane doesn't behave like that. Methane is what's called a short-lived climate pollutant. So methane goes up, has a pulse, and then is broken down into carbon dioxide and water and is reabsorbed back into the system. So the way that we've traditionally been accounting for it is actually, you know, not quite right. So we're including that in the calculation. And as I say, we launched the new version at Oxford back in January. There's various stages in terms of calculating your carbon footprint. You log on, you create an account. That account is there for you. It doesn't disappear off to DEFRA or the RPA or anyone like that. That's just for you to do whatever you want with. You can create your accounts. You then add the information into these different categories. So information on fuels, which is things like diesel, electricity, those sort of things. Materials, things you use in the farm in a calendar year. Inventory, so that's the capital cost associated with the buildings and machinery. Crop, so anything you're growing. Input, so that's fertilizers, any sort of sprays, that sort of stuff. Livestock, so both the type of livestock, the production system that you're running them on, and also any feed. Waste, distribution, and then sequestration. And all that information goes in, and then you get a report out at the end of it, which gives you your carbon balance. And put simply, as I say, that carbon balance of that example farm over there is emissions minus sequestration. And this is where we get another one of the slightly confounding issues when we're communicating about carbon, is that unlike your bank account, a negative number here is a really good thing, because that means that this farm is pulling in more carbon than it is emitting. So that's a carbon positive farm. And one of the things we get when we're looking at carbon footprinting is that we get a lot of focus on this bit, this process bit. There's this bit that's in red there. You know, there's a lot of attention in terms of how do we get the process and how that works. Whereas actually the really important bit and the really exciting bit is that second bit, in terms of once you've got the result, what does that mean? And actually interpreting the results is a key part of it, really. You know, it's really important. The processing bit, you know, getting the information into the calculator is the boring bit, is the bit that means that you have to go and find some data and you have to put it in. But actually, once that bit's done, you can do the really exciting bit. And trust me, it can be exciting, you know, looking at what the opportunities are for the future. So interpreting results is really important. It gives you that baseline. It gives you that understanding of, okay, here's where we're starting. Now let's just see what we can change. And it gives you that evidence in terms of what, you know, if you want to change your management, if you wanted to start to, you know, change some grazing, or if you wanted to start to look at, well, you know, what would happen if I managed to, you know, manage my cattle in a different way, or I did something different with the manure, or, you know, or I looked at something different. What would the impact be on my carbon footprint? And you can get all that information from that first step. So that's the sort of process of carbon footprinting. But what actually can we do about it and those emissions? And to start that conversation, we'll have to say, well, where do the emissions come from? You know, and I will take the point that there's no such thing as a typical farm, but I've sort of pretended that there is such thing as a typical farm on this graph, just to show, well, actually, on a typical farm, where are the main sources of emissions? And if we look at a purely arable farm, then about 60% of that is coming from fertilizer. And that's both the production of the fertilizer and then also its application on the farm. About 20% is coming from fuel use and field operations. So that's cultivations in the field, that's diesel that's used for the tractors, and that's the capital cost of the tractors. About another 10% is coming from the use of P and K fertilizer, from manures or from lime. About another just under 10% coming from the emissions of the seed getting to the farm for you to plant. And then a very small percentage is crop protection. If we look at a ruminant livestock farm, now you can see why there's been such an attention on methane. Half of the emissions from a ruminant livestock farm are coming from the animals themselves in terms of that process of taking forage and turning it into something that we can eat, be it meat or milk. 20% is coming from manures, either in terms of how we manage, store and apply those manures. So whether it's, solid manure or slurry, how long we're storing it for, whether we're composting it, how we're applying it in the field, all of that comes into that 20%. About 10% is bagged fertilizer use, so artificial fertilizer. About 10% is any imported feed that's coming onto the farm to feed the stock. And then about 10% is power and fuel. So there's lots of opportunities. Although half of that emission is going, directly with the stock, you can see that there's opportunities with the other half, and there's still opportunities within that methane that's coming from the stock themselves. And when we start to say, well, what are the things that we can do in terms of reducing emissions? There's sort of 5 broad areas to focus on. The first one is very much looking at optimizing livestock performance, and there are loads and loads of opportunities in terms of improving efficiency through looking at improved livestock health, in terms of reproductive efficiency, in terms of looking at feed, feed conversion, maximizing the amount of forage, all those sort of things, really, really important. Soils, fertilizers and manures, again, massive topic, lots of opportunities, both in terms of improved soil structure, improved soil health, looking at making sure that our soils are in as good structure as possible. We're minimizing the amount of compaction. We're looking at integrating, manure use with fertilizer use, all those sort of things, looking at how we're applying, loads and loads of opportunities there. Energy and fuel use is the really, really boring stuff. It's the stuff that quite often gets left, but can be really, really good, and also can be really, really good in terms of saving costs. Renewable energy, if that's an option, and then holding carbon on the farm in terms of our woody biomass. So that's very much focusing on emissions. But what about sequestration? And what are the opportunities that we have to do that positive bit? I've very much been showing where the emissions are coming from in terms of negative, the emissions, but actually we've got this unique opportunity as our industry to be able to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and hold it. So how does that fit into the accounting process? Well, we can start by sort of saying, well, what is sequestration? It's a word that's bandied about quite a lot, both through policymakers, through academia and research, and also by others. But actually, put simply, carbon sequestration is basically the process of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and holding it. And on farm, we can do that through trees, we can do that through hedgerows, we can do that through stewardship, and we can do that through soil. And it's a unique opportunity. So although there's been a lot of attention on our industry in terms of its environmental impact, one of the things we need to sort of push and promote is that we are not just one of the causes of climate change, we have some of the solutions. And that's really, really important. And it starts to be able to, really change that conversation, because we're providing solutions. We are one of the only industries that can suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by growing plants, which is what we're doing as part of our farming systems. Now, currently, that sequestration is accounted for in this delightful acronym called LULUCF, which stands for land use, change and forestry. So when we account for our national emissions, so when we report back up to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in terms of the UK's emissions, the way that that's currently set out is that land use, change and forestry, so the positive stuff, actually is a completely separate category to agriculture. So it's one of the reasons that they've been separated, and actually they're incredibly intrinsically linked together. So that's one of the reasons why we've been seen as quite a negative, when actually because the positive has been completely split out. Another really important thing is that we need to make sure that we're not just talking about sequestration. So sequestration is that process of actively pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is incredibly important, and we need that. But actually, we also really need to focus on, well, once we've captured that carbon, what then happens to it? So carbon storage and protecting the carbon that we've already stored through historical land use, through, you know, the grasses that have been down there, you know, have been photosynthesizing, or the crops have been there photosynthesizing, and they've been pulling that carbon in. So that we've got to protect the carbon that we've already got, as well as look at the opportunities to pull more carbon in. So we're really lucky, because we can do this through what we're doing anyway in terms of farming. Then we've got this whole other industry around carbon capture and storage, which is how we, you know, which is what other industries are trying to do in terms of how can they mechanize this process. So how can they, you know, when they're doing their industrial manufacturing, all that sort of stuff, how can they capture that carbon and store it? So there's a whole lot of focus and a whole lot of government funding going towards how does this become a better thing to do? But we can do it anyway. So there's three key questions, really, I think, when we're talking about carbon sequestration for farmers. And these are the sort of fundamental questions when we're looking at how do we hang policies or payments off this in the future. How much carbon? So how much carbon do I have? How much more carbon can I get? And how does what I do as the farmer and my management impact on the carbon that I've already got and the potential carbon I can have in the future? How much is it worth? So, you know, what's the sort of tonnage of carbon that I've already got? And then what's the potential that I can be paid for it? And then how much more can I get? So how much have I already got in terms of that carbon stock? And then how can I adapt my management to pull more carbon in? And how can I link that to what I'm trying to do in terms of my future farming plans? And these are the sort of questions that we need to start thinking about. And if you look at some of the narrative that's been around carbon sequestration, there's been such a focus on trees. And you could say, well, why has there been such a focus on trees? Well, there's been such a focus on trees because it's easy to measure. The science that was needed for forestry carbon sequestration has been done for the past, you know, for over 20 years. They've done this information. We know how much carbon is held in the tree. We know how much carbon is held in the soil under the trees, and we know how much is held in the canopy. And so that, you know, that's one of the reasons why policymakers love it, because they can very easily and quite quickly work out, well, this is the amount of carbon that we need to offset. How many hectares of trees do we need to plant? What species will give us the most carbon? Bish, bash, bosh, done, easy. I don't know how hedgy you guys are up there, because I know sometimes whether you're walls or hedges, but if you have got hedges, hedges are also a really good carbon store as well. But that's one of the reasons that they've been focusing on trees. But actually, for us as farmers, we've got a much more exciting opportunity, which means that we can continue to farm. We're not having to say, you know, we're not having to have a land sharing, land sparing discussion. Actually, we can continue to farm and actually still provide that climate solution. And that's the opportunity that comes from soil carbon. And it's really, again, it's a really exciting time. And there's lots of things happening around this whole area of how much carbon can we store and what are the opportunities with it. So starting again, what is soil organic carbon? Well, soil organic carbon is basically the energy of the sun flowing through your soil, and it's decomposing plants. And if you think about how your soil is made up, and if you sort of put it on a pie chart, about 45% of your soil is mineral. So it's, you know, whatever sand, silt, clay, all that sort of stuff which is in there. Then if your soil is in good condition, then about a quarter of it is air and about a quarter of it is water. And that remaining 5% is soil organic matter. And soil organic carbon is about 60% of soil organic matter, okay? And it's the underground industry that's supporting your farm and is doing all those fantastic functions that your farm needs in order to improve its resilience. It's nutrient cycling, it's holding water, it's letting water drain more slowly, it's helping your soil structure, it's providing a habitat and a home for the biology that are doing all sorts of things. It's incredibly important. And we need, as I say, we need to be sort of looking at how we can improve that, you know, for the opportunities that it provides in terms of environmental protection. But also we've got this other really good benefit in the fact that if we can increase our soil carbon, we can also increase our yields. And this was some work that's been done over in the States, by Ratan Lal, who's one of the sort of early proponents of soil carbon. But you can see that actually, if you can increase your soil organic carbon percentage, then actually you can improve all those things which lead to agronomic productivity. So you can improve the aggregation of your soil, how it's held together. You can improve the amount of nutrients that are available. You can improve infiltration rate and water holding capacity. And you can improve porosity. And you can get rid or reduce all those things that actually impact on your production around erosion and compaction and crusting. So actually there's a really good benefit, bottom line benefit for looking at how we can increase soil carbon. And this is something that's really being looked at in terms of policy at the moment. When we had the agricultural bill, which disappeared and then came back again, when it came back, one of the really good things that was in it was that soil health was in there defined as a public good. And the great thing about soil health being in there is that as it's in there and defined as a public good, we can now pay people off the back of it, which is brilliant. The confusion thing now, the thing we were trying to work out is, well, what do we pay them for and how much and how does it work? Which is great. But the other really important thing to think about is, although soil carbon is one part of it, we also have to look at reducing emissions from soils. And one of the big emissions from soils, if you think back when we started, is nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide is a really bad greenhouse gas. If you think about all the attention that we've had on methane, methane's only, and sort of setting aside what I was just saying about the new way of measuring methane, methane's about 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide is 298 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So its ability as a gas to increase global warming is much higher. And we at agriculture are 80% of the issue with nitrous oxide. So reducing emissions from soils is a really key thing. And that comes down to trying to minimize compaction, trying to make sure you've got good amounts of air in your soil so that actually when you apply different nutrients, they're going to do what you want them to do, which is, be sucked up by your plant roots to allow your crops to grow, rather than either being lost to the atmosphere or to the watercourses or all those sort of things. So this is just, as I say, just hammering that point around, protecting the carbon that you've already got is incredibly important. And actually a key to that is actually that structure and maintaining soil aggregation to protect that carbon and then look at the opportunities to pull more carbon in. Okay, so how do we do it then? How do we pull more carbon out of the atmosphere? Well, traditionally, and this is the sort of accounting way of doing it, and this is how the sort of land use change that I was talking to you about earlier, is that if you're an arable field or if you're an arable farm, you take your land out of arable and you put it into grass. If you're a grassland farm, you move it from grass and you plant trees on it. So that's been one of the reasons why there's been a lot of focus on tree planting. But we all know that within those broad definitions of arable, grassland and forestry, there's big differences in terms of our land's capability. And so we need to be able to reflect that variation. If we reduce erosion, so if we reduce the amount of soil that's actually disappearing out the farm gate, then actually that soil is not only taking nutrients with it, but it's also taking carbon with it. So keeping the soil in the field is really important. Looking at feeding more carbon into the system by looking at the use of manures and other products where opportunities are. Reducing tillage, so reducing the amount of carbon that's being lost from the system. And then looking where their opportunities are to look at sort of more deep rooting species and actually starting to put that carbon further down the soil profile where it's less likely to be lost. So when we start looking at some of these questions and how we start, what are the sort of key points? Well, actually for policymakers, how do we sort of start to hang a payment system off it? Well, we've got complex biological systems, haven't we? Each farm is different. So how do we start to create a payment, a way that works when we've got lots of different variations in there? And actually, irrespective of what you guys do in terms of your management, because they're so dependent on weather and all the rest of it, we have a leaky system. It's non-replicable. So if somebody does it on this farm, actually you won't get the same results if you do it over here. What do we measure and how do we measure it? Can we pay people against it? And for policymakers, it's all a bit new and scary. So it's a bit difficult to do anything with. For farmers, we know that actually we want to sort of maintain and protect those stocks that we've already got on our farm. And we want to do that because we're actually of its role in our sort of improved agronomic performance, and also because there's opportunities, potentially for payments and stuff in the future. But we need to look at what works and that evidence in terms of what works within those systems. So, you know, for example, on arable farms, you know, is it no-till or is it min-till or is it a combination or is it strip-till? What's the difference between those things? If we start looking at livestock systems, you know, what's the difference between, you know, a permanent pasture or something where you put some, you know, you potentially spin some other bits into, or, you know, just grass clover, or you have how many species of diversity, all those sort of things. How, cover crops, use of manures. And we need that information from farm level data rather than models, because that all of that starts with knowing what and how we measure. So in terms of making cash from soil carbon, you know, we can do that by having a payment. So we can have a payment for increasing soil carbon. We can improve our bottom line by increasing our yields or our quality through increasing our soil carbon and improving our soil health. But again, we still come down to this point of, well, how do we prove that soil carbon is increasing? And that's what we've been really looking at in terms of our soil carbon project. Really, and we've got 3 key aims really. Firstly, how do we test for soil carbon? You know, what is the way we do it? Is it organic matter? Is it soil organic carbon? Is it carbon to clay ratio? Is it carbon to nitrogen ratio? You know, throwing all the different potential tests that are out there into the pot to see, well, what, you know, what are these tests telling us? How much do they cost? How practical are they? All those sort of things. Is it linked to any, you know, to any proxy measures? So can we say that there's a link between soil carbon and infiltration? Can we say there's a link between soil carbon and soil structure? All those sort of things. Also looking at depth. And depth is a really interesting one, because a lot of the work that's been done in terms of soil carbon has very much been at very shallow depth. And what's really interesting is that actually if you start to deepen that depth that you're looking at, and especially when you start to talk about some of these areas which have got deep soils and have got that capacity to be able to store more carbon, then actually you open up a whole other world of possibilities. But actually being able to differentiate what's going on at different depths through the soil is really important. So once we've done all that testing and we've worked out what we're testing, what the most important thing to test for is, the second thing is saying, well, okay, then now we know how to test for it. What is the impact of these management practices? So what are those management practices that we know that are really, really beneficial, and those ones that aren't? And then the final thing is saying, well, how does soil carbon fit within the whole farm carbon footprint? So what's the potential for carbon positive farms? And just a couple of things to pick up really that we've been finding so far. We're about to start, well, we're sort of 6 months through year 3 of this project, is that we found that if you can move from set stock to rotational, and you know, if you want to go the whole hog and go towards mob grazing, fair enough, but actually if you can just start to do a little bit more rotational grazing, then we're finding that consistently that is improving soil carbon levels from anywhere from 0.1 to 0.6% per hectare per year. And that may not sound like a lot, but if you think that if you can improve your soil organic matter by 0.1%, then that can sequester you, or that can pull in an extra 9 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So if you multiply that up, you don't have to do very much to actually suddenly get a huge upsurge in carbon, which actually when you start to put that back onto your carbon footprint is really, really valuable. So we're cautiously optimistic that that's really good. If the opportunities arise and you can include some deep rooting species, so if you've got any land that you are able to improve and you are able to reseed, you know, looking to put those deep rooting species is really important. And if you can include legumes, then not only are you improving the carbon percentage and the carbon potential, you're also reducing fertilizer, which is good for soil carbon and also reducing emissions. The other really interesting thing we found is this link between soil aggregate stability and soil organic carbon. And aggregate stability is a fantastic test because you guys can all do it. It doesn't cost you anything. You don't need any expensive equipment. You know, you can all do it at home. All you need to do is go and dig a hole in the field, take a handful of soil out, put it on a sunny windowsill or in an airing cupboard and let it dry for a couple of days. And then the little aggregate, the little lumps of soil and the little particles that it breaks down to, you submerge them in water and you watch what happens to them. And it's a bit like when you dunk a biscuit in a cup of tea. What you want is you want your soil to stick together, because those glues and those sort of, you know, those bits that are holding your soil together show that you've got good levels of carbon in there, because that's the glomulins and the other bits that, you know, the secretions that your biology is producing, which actually sticks your soil particles together. And aggregation is key to all of the sort of, you know, soil functions that we need. So it's incredibly important. And you can see those 2 examples there. You can see that bottom one where it's like, you know, it's a bit like some of those biscuits that just you find all the dregs in the bottom at the end of the cup. You know, it's just, You know, that's not what we want our soil to do, because as soon as it rains, that's what happens to it. And especially as, you know, the man was saying at the beginning about, you know, you've got high rainfall. We want your soils to be able to, you know, really be able to accept as much of that rainfall as possible and continue to be well structured. And it's so important, especially around carbon. So it's a test that you can all do. And as I say, it doesn't cost you anything. So you know, you can then start to say, well, how does that link through? You know, where are the areas on my farm which have got good aggregation? Where are the areas which have less good aggregation? And what can we do to improve them? And you can do these tests. You know, they don't take a lot of expertise or effort or equipment, just to see how things are going, and whether, you know, when you start to change your management, whether you're actually seeing an impact. So that's really exciting, and that's something that we're carrying on with. So just to conclude, really, I suppose, you know, what does this all mean? We've had a really, really quick run through, you know, the calculator and soil carbon and how this all works. But I suppose just some sort of thoughts, and again, hopefully it might stimulate a little bit of discussion, especially around this. You know, we've now got a way of measuring soil carbon that is, you know, verifiable, scientifically robust, and cost effective. So that's brilliant. You know, that's really, really good, and that's a really good step forward. You know, soil health is a public good. You know, this is fab that soil health has now been classified as a public good. But what do we pay farmers on? Are we paying farmers on soil organic matter? Are we paying farmers on soil organic carbon? So that still needs to be sort of ironed out. There's still a lot of questions around testing frequency and accuracy. So how many samples, you know, how accurate, you know, how is it 1 sample per field? Is it 20 samples per field? How, you know, how do those sample locations need to be verified? How often do we need to test? At the moment, we're testing, you know, we're testing every year. And soil test, you know, that's quite noisy, testing every year, especially for soil organic matter and soil organic carbon. We've got a couple of fields where we're testing every month to look at how it changes. And actually, it's really, I was really surprised by the ranges that are there. So again, how frequently do you test to actually be able to see whether you're, you know, maintaining, increasing, or losing? How can we actually take best practice from some of those global models that are there that take into account, you know, payment by measurement or model? We've got systems that are out there working. In Australia, farmers are paid by measurement. In America, they're paid by model. In Canada, it's a mixture of measurement and model. So this is all really, really moving at the moment in terms of how do we start to take best practice from what's happening globally. How do we differentiate between carbon stock, so the carbon that's already there, and additional carbon that we're pulling in? And I think, to be totally honest, I think we will end up with a 2-tiered payment system where we'll have sort of stewardship / you know, Natural England type payment, which will pay for our carbon stock, and then the opportunity to leverage in private finance and other options for carbon sequestration. And there's loads of private finance interest in the moment in terms of new companies, new setups who are starting to understand that this is a really good opportunity. And there's lots of businesses that want to invest in farmers. So we've just got to make that middle bit in terms of how we do the verification and the testing work, which is really exciting. So just to finish off then, really, you know, and just some final thoughts. You know, the time to act and the time to really sort of get your head around how this, you know, how this impacts on your business is now, both in terms of soil carbon and the opportunities, but also on your carbon footprint. You know, the level, and without being a doom mongerer, which I don't like being, you know, the level of regulation, bureaucracy, and legislation is only moving in one direction. You know, we are not under mandatory reductions. They're coming, and actually, it's so this is a really good opportunity to start to say, well, you know, what is the size of my individual challenge? So do a carbon footprint. You know, I'm happy to help and provide guidance to anyone that wants to do it in terms of just, well, you know, where are the areas that in the future I might want to focus on, because these are the areas that are the hotspots that are producing the most emissions at the moment. But it's also really important to remember that monitoring business performance and driving efficiencies makes business sense. So actually, this is just another lens to look at business efficiency through. You know, it's a really good, just fresh pair of eyes, fresh way to look at something. It safeguards resources, and then it also cuts your carbon footprint. There are opportunities, there are business opportunities here. You know, there are lots of, you know, we're doing some work with different supply chains now who are starting to say, well, you know, I know that I'm producing stuff in a low carbon way. So how can I then sell that story to the consumer? How can I link up with others along the supply chain to start to create low carbon supply chains? And how can we verify that? There are business opportunities. There are opportunities to add value to products by being able to, you know, report the carbon credentials of these things, especially around ruminant products, especially around beef and lamb systems. And all of this is moving really quickly, and it's really exciting. And we need to keep providing the data. So data is really important, be it individual farm carbon footprint data, be it aggregating that together across landscapes, which is really exciting, so that we can start to sort of tell people what's happening in terms of emissions, but also the opportunities for sequestration. Skills development, you know, this stuff is complicated, it is changing all the time, so we need to have sessions like this and opportunities to discuss, you know, so that you can understand what it means for your business. And then also pilot schemes. So let's try some things out. Let's try paying farmers for soil carbon sequestration and see what happens. Let's try looking at how we can, you know, how we can work together across landscapes. So that's really the end of what I was going to say. As I say, I'm happy to take questions or or answer any sort of comments or anything you may have. If anybody is interested or would like to do the carbon footprint, you know, I'm more than happy to help. If anybody wants to do anything around, you know, sort of soil testing, all that sort of stuff, again, you know, I'm more than happy to help, because that's what we've really been set up to do. But as I say, if anybody's got any questions, please shout. But my email address is also there, so if anybody wants to, you know, get in touch afterwards, please do.
Yeah, that's great, Becky. Thank you very much. Fascinated, and I love your enthusiasm on the subject as well. What sort of interest, what sort of take-up been like in your area with the carbon toolkit? How have the farmers got on?
So it's been really interesting, actually. If you go back, and it's been really interesting to chart the progress of it. If you go back sort of 18 months, 2 years ago, you know, we probably had, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 farmers a month would sign up, you know, in terms of starting the process. You know, it was really those ones that had done everything else, done all those really boring jobs, you know, literally mended all the track, you know, done everything else, even maybe looked at, you know, changing their electricity supply, and there was nothing else to do. All those that had a particular interest in it. But what we found is since the new version launched back in January, we're just shy of 3,000 new users, and which is fantastic. And I think there's been a couple of sort of push points really to that. One of them, you know, there has been a lot of interest from livestock farmers who are really looking to try and understand, well, you know, is my livestock as bad as everyone tells me it is? You know, and actually what, you know, that focus on methane emissions and ruminants, you know, has meant, well, people are saying, well, you know, is it that bad? And you can say, well, actually, no, it's not. The other thing is that a lot of people are interested in understanding the sequestration value. So, you know, what their sequestration assets are. But certainly, you know, working with farmers, so I spend a lot of my time helping farmers, you know, helping farmers through this, and actually helping them understand and do some interpretation at the end of it. You know, I will have to hold my hands up. The process of actually putting the data in is, you know, is boring, is not the most exciting job to do, but we've tried to make it that once you've done it once, actually, so when you then go back and do your report again next year, you can just copy last year's report. So the process is hopefully only painful once, and then it's just a case of, you know, you can just update anything that's changed. But what we're working on currently as well is some benchmarking and some opportunities to compare between farmers and between sort of different sectors as well. Because the other thing I think we need a lot more sort of understanding of, well, what does that footprint mean? What's a good footprint and what's a bad footprint? Or not, nobody has a bad footprint, but, you know, what's a less good footprint? And then what does that sort of mean in terms of what do we do next? I think the other problem that we've had is that, you know, there's been some supply chain carbon footprinting that's been done in the past through different, I mean, a lot of dairy farms have it as part of their milk contract, you know, which is a really good opportunity. But the problem is that for those supply chain companies, you know, a lot of what they want is the number at the bottom of it, because it sits within their carbon accounting schemes, and that's where the interest finishes. Whereas actually, you know, for the farmer, the interest is actually, well, what does those numbers mean, and what can we do about it? So I think there's still a lot we can do around how we interpret those carbon footprints in a way which has meaning back to the farmer, and how we can bring bring groups of farmers together. And I've done some quite interesting work recently with a few groups where we've done some comparison across, and that can be really enlightening in terms of looking at what you can change and sharing ideas, because again it's just another way of looking at business performance really. But there has been unprecedented growth this year in this, both in terms of wanting to sort of see what's going on, but also commercial opportunities. So as I said a minute ago, we're working with farms who are using it to demonstrate the carbon credentials of their business and are seeing new business development through that. We're working with big estates who are wanting to hit their sort of net zero targets and start to develop their strategies, and also working with a really interesting one that's we've been doing quite recently, is working with some of the banks. So the banks are starting to work with their agricultural clients as well.
Yes.